All right, welcome to My Bible App class. Those of you who are watching us online, we are so glad that you went to the website because that's what we've been talking about this morning in this classroom. Go to the website. You can download whatever handouts you're missing. You can see whatever videos of the classes that you've missed. So we're glad that you're watching us online. Today's a very important day. Everything that we've learned up to this point has been taught to you just for this day. I could have given you today on the first day. But if I would have given you today on the first day, you guys would write me off and never come back. You would think I was crazy. Nobody would follow through with anything that I'm going to tell you today. I promise you. I've seen it happen before. Because today is the crux of everything. If you have identified with what you've learned in this class, then the question that you must be asking, and some of you have been hitting me for, is, what do we do about it, Dwayne? I get it. I have had rejection in my life. Check. I realize that I've responded negatively to that rejection. Check. Yes, I identify that there's bitterness in my life. Check. Okay, so that's great. Now we're all aware of it. What do we do about it? And I've told a few of you, come back, keep coming, because there's a lot more that you've got to have for a foundation in order to get rid of the bitterness. It's not an easy thing to do. There's it is the most emotional thing that you're ever going to do in your life. I have counseled with people who have had traumas beyond anything that you could imagine. And they have come back after doing what I'm going to teach you today and getting rid of their bitterness and told me this tops everything, both negatively and positively. It's very emotional. The reason why is because bitterness has control of your life. And it doesn't want to let go. So let's do a quick review of some terms that we've used because it's going to be important, all right? In this series, Breaking the Bondage of Sin, we must first understand that that's a tongue-in-cheek kind of title because the bondage of sin was destroyed when Christ died. If you've accepted Christ as your personal Savior, you're free from sin. So that bondage is already broken. But the problem is that the average believer doesn't understand that truth, and so they sit in their sin patterns. They sit in this mindset, in this emotional junk, believing that they're still sinners, believing that they are still having to struggle with all of the things that they struggled with before they got saved. And it's just not true. Jesus talked about dogs going back to their vomit. And that's exactly what Christians do. My father says it this way. He probably says it in his book somewhere if you've been reading Rejection Junkies. That the average Christian trades the burden of sin for the burden of righteousness, which is basically the same thing as saying, I still think I'm a sinner, and I'm still trying to prove to God that I should go to heaven. That's what that's all about. We're so worried and concerned about our behaviors. We're so worried and concerned about our thoughts. What we don't understand is that our spirit, once we've been born again, has already left us and is in heaven at the right hand of the Father. It's only a matter of time before the soul joins it when our bodies die. And then it's only a matter of time after that when Christ resurrects those bodies and brings us all three parts back together again in His presence. For us. For God, it's already done. All three is there. He's rejoicing with us, body, soul, and spirit, in heavenly places right now. And so that's a reality for God. But it's hard for us to wrap our head around that reality because we're still struggling day to day on this earth. So, the first thing that's important to understand is that our spirits are already with God, but our soul is still here, and our soul is struggling mentally and emotionally. Here's the terms I want you to really get pinned down, okay? Rejection syndrome. What is rejection syndrome? The word syndrome indicates a cycle. Bottom line, everybody gets rejected. Never met a person yet that can say, I've never been rejected in my life. There's two types of rejection we learned about, overt and covert rejection. I'm not going to spend time reviewing those this time. But those types of rejection have become a regular part of our life. It comes from all kinds of sources. Mom and dad, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, grandparents, friends, colleagues, teachers, you name it, okay? Sometimes rejection comes from people we don't even know. Sometimes rejection can come from, the government or from like Bible teachers on TV, preachers who are making people feel guilty because they're not giving enough to that ministry, things like that. And we feel rejected in those cases. Most of us feel rejected by God. because we don't understand our relationship with God. And so we think that God's mad at us, He's angry with us, or bad things happen in our life, and we think that God made that happen because of something else we did. All those kinds of ideas swirl around in our mind. And it's all part of the rejection syndrome. When we cycle that rejection over and over and over, and it's only a matter of time before we start doing the rejecting to other people. Because one of the things that's interesting about this whole series is that it's easy for us to identify how we've been hurt by other people. Oh yeah, Dwayne, I was rejected. Oh, my mother, you can't believe that woman. My dad, what a horrible person he was. This person, that person, all this list of people that have rejected me over my lifetime. But what we don't tend to think about is how much rejection you've given to other people. You have rejected people. You have been the source of their pain in life. You've done it overtly, and you've done it covertly. And the reason you've done it is because that's all you know to do. That's how you have learned how to have relationship. Maybe you're the overbearing, dominant, A-type personality that just controls everything. Maybe you're the opposite. You're the passive, laid-back, quiet one who doesn't control anything at all. And in both scenarios, that's the typical scenario. We can add things like the passive people tend to be sarcastic and snarky because they sit back in their arrogance and in their self-righteousness, and they look at the loud, controlling, dominant people and go, well, if they didn't act like that, then my life wouldn't be so miserable. How many of you are like that? Don't raise your hand. And of course, the dominant, loud, overbearing people, they get blamed a lot because they're dominant, loud, and overbearing. And they're rude. And they're disrespectful. And they're controlling. And they're pushy. And all of those things are true, and all of those things are destructive. But unfortunately, the passive people sit back in their self-righteousness and point and go, well, at least I'm not like you. And then they pull away, and they hide, and they don't talk. They won't work anything out. They don't do any of that kind of stuff. So, guys, I don't care whether you're the overt rejecter or whether you're the covert rejecter. You reject. That's a reality of your life. I know you've been hurt by other people, and I know you've been rejected by other people, but you reject as well. Okay, so we got to get to a point where we're willing to accept our role in the problem. But we can't do that until we get rid of certain things, and one of those things is we got to break out of this syndrome. All right? The next thing that we learned about is what's termed mental and emotional bondage. Okay, remember the circle? We had the spirit, the soul, and the body, and we focused in on the soul. The soul is made up of three primary things: the mind, the emotions, and the will. The mind knows certain things to be true. The emotions feel certain things to be true. Those two factions are in conflict with one another. I know that everything's going to be okay, but I feel like my world is falling apart. I know that God loves me, but I feel like He's angry at me. I know there's hope for my marriage, but I feel like there's no hope. And on and on and on it goes. And when those two gears grind together like that over a long period of time, eventually they break down. The will becomes the victim in this whole thing. The will is what gets damaged. The will is the ability to exercise what the thoughts and the emotions are processing. And when the will is being pulled one way by the mind and being pulled a different way by the emotions, it's like, guys, make a decision here. Which do you want me to do? I can't do both. And the will ends up breaking down. Last week we looked at the body. What happens to the body when the mind and the emotions are in bondage? When that conflict is going on, we see all kinds of symptoms in the body. How many of you did your homework last week? From last week? 1, 2 of you. Wonderful. That's awesome. I'm glad you guys are engaged. Thank you for doing that. Would you be comfortable with sharing any of your symptoms of the body that you identified? Upper back pain. Yeah, very good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. A lot of tension there. Brian. Food. Yeah. Wow, you used to be 300. Good for you, man. You've been losing weight. That's awesome. Yeah. So it becomes a struggle. Guys, let me tell you, that's an absolute reality, because here's another thing that we've focused in on a little bit. Well, I've just identified, I wouldn't say I've focused in on, but that's coping. Most of the techniques that are out there are in the psychological world, therapy world, are coping techniques. They're not really designed to solve problems. They're just designed to help you deal with problems and become a functioning alcoholic, or in this case, a functioning rejection junkie. Okay? So diets are one of those things. Whatever your symptom is in your body, whether it's food, like Brian's identifying, or it's upper back pain, or it's ulcers, or it's, I'm constipated all the time, or it's headaches, or what were you going to say? Sleeplessness, insomnia, or total exhaustion. No matter how much sleep you sleep, you still wake up tired, and you're sleeping constantly, eating chocolate, those are all symptoms of a bigger problem. Okay, this conflict between the mind and the emotions, and the depression and anxiety and fear and worry and doubt and insecurity and so on and so forth, and then ultimately, physically, we see the divorce and the drug addiction and the alcohol abuse and the eating disorders and so on and so forth. All of this is just the sign of a bigger problem. Now, what have we identified is the root problem? That's the next term I want to talk to you about, is the root problem. What did Scripture tell us is the root problem that's creating all of this chaos in our life? Anyone? Don't be afraid to call it out. Besides my wife. Bitterness. Hebrews chapter 12 tells us very clearly that the root of bitterness, calls it a root. I find it fascinating, calls it a root, because from roots grow what? Trees, bushes, other plants, right? We see things above the ground, but what do we not see? We do not see the roots that are underneath the ground that are causing the plants to grow. Look at the plants as symptoms. The roots are bitterness. Okay? And from that bitterness, two things happen. It causes you to be what? Troubled, and it defiles many. Okay, so back to where I started. People reject you, you become bitter, and your turmoil begins. You are feeling nervous, and you are feeling depressed, and you are feeling angry, and you are feeling lots of different emotions that are stimulated from this rejection. And guys, let me tell you something. Just because you have those emotions in and of themselves, it's not a bad thing. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel depressed. It's okay to be sad about stuff and feel nervous about things. Those emotions in and of themselves are not negative. But what happens is that when those emotions in the beginning, when we're young, when they start cycling, bitterness takes its opportunity to confirm for us that those emotions are okay to have. And they get locked in place. Bitterness is a deceiver. The very definition of the word bitterness, and as Scripture uses it in Hebrews, means to seize or to capture. It becomes your new master. So, Christ frees you from all the sin, but bitterness comes in and goes, you're not really that free. And we buy into that lie. And we stay in our prisons. Whatever your prison is, whatever you've got yourself trapped in, you've given yourself over to bitterness, and bitterness now controls your soul. Christ controls your spirit, but bitterness controls your soul. And when we get rid of the bitterness in our soul, then the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance, are all part of what gets to filter into our soul. Now we can get rid of the depression that has been cycling our whole lives, the habits of those negative emotions, the insecurities, the feeling that nobody loves me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go eat some worms. Okay? All that stuff can be destroyed permanently. Guess what? Because Christ died, you don't have to cope with anything. Because Christ died, you can be free permanently in this life. That's the great news. But I'm not going to tell you that it's easy. And that's what today is all about, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is Dwayne is going to put his copies in here so that I have something to reference while I'm talking to you. That would be nice, wouldn't it? When the teacher has his game on, that's always a good thing. All right. So I would like you to start passing those around, please. All right. So the very first thing, well, here's the new term I'm going to give you for today. Action therapy. Okay? Most of the therapy and counseling programs that are out there are coping therapy, even if they're Christian. Because Christians teach that you need to turn it over to the Lord, you need to let go and let God, that you need to lay it at the feet of Jesus, that you need to pray about it more, that you need to read your Bible more, that you need to get filled with the Holy Spirit more, that you need to attend church more. There's a list of things, of activities that are really not technically they're activities, but they're basically non-starters. I've never met a bitter person yet who went to more church and that solved their bitterness problem. I've never seen it happen. Never seen a person get free from their bitterness because they read more Bible verses or memorized more Bible verses. Never seen it happen. I've seen people attempt it, but I've never seen it work. Bible doesn't teach that. There's nowhere in Scripture that tells us if you go to church more, your bitterness will go away. It doesn't teach that anywhere. It does teach something else, though, and we're going to start that process today. Next week, I'm going to get into the Scripture part of it, but this week I want to set you up with the practical application part of it, okay? And so the first thing that we need to do is get out a piece of paper if you have one. And if you don't, maybe you can, well, I've copied on both sides of these papers, so I didn't. Oh, that's right. There you go. Back side of this one will work. Okay, very good. And I've got for you on this first page, it says review your life's history. Yeah, how many of you have been avoiding that all your life? Yeah. Now, typically what I would do if this were a normal counseling process or seminar that we've done in the past is I would spend an entire 8-hour day with you and I would walk you through your entire life. I have a whole series of questions that starts from the time that you started life, you know, how old were you when you were born, that kind of thing. And it walks you all the way through up to this point in time in your life. It identifies and addresses most, if not all, of the major relationships that you've had in your life. And it's designed to draw out all of the relationships and types of rejection that you've experienced. But the primary purpose of that process is to identify the roots of bitterness that are in your life. Well, I don't have time in this type of scenario. We have 1 hour once a week. I don't have time to go through your entire history with you, okay? So you're going to have to work on that on your own. But I'm going to give you a couple of pointers here, starting with this paragraph. Now that you've been able to identify the rejection, you need to make a list of those individuals who you have become bitter toward. Your list should be prioritized as follows. So now we're going to make up your bitterness list, okay? So you're going to have to take some time, and this is part of your homework this week. For those of you who didn't do your homework last week, I really hope you do your homework this week, for your sake. I mean, quite frankly, it makes no difference to me one way or the other. You want to stay bitter, stay bitter. I don't care. I mean, I care, but I'm not going to worry about it. You've been bitter a long time, and you've learned how to survive that way. You'll keep being bitter the rest of your life till you die, and you'll figure out a way to make that work, I'm sure. So I'm not that concerned over it. But I hope you're that concerned over it, because it's your life. It's your relationships. It's your marriage. It's your children. It's your job. It's your siblings. It's your other family members. So I hope you care. Okay? I hope you care. What I'm about to teach you to do in making up this list and the rest that we learned today, I started doing this over 30 years ago. And I've never stopped. This is something that has literally revolutionized my life, and not because it's some wonderful thing my dad wrote about, but because this is God's design. God understands the problem that humans are born into, and He gives us ways to be free, to walk in freedom. Okay, so this is the most practical way that we've been able to identify so far. Maybe somebody will come up with some ingenious thing in the future, but right now this works very well. And I'm just saying that as a testament because I've been doing it for over 30 years. Okay? So it works. So here's the way you make your list. First, number one on your list, and it's going to be in a little outline just like I have right here. Number 1, letter A. Number 2, letter A. Letter B. Maybe there's a letter C in here somewhere. Number 3, number 4, number 5, letter A, letter B. So that's how you want to make it, just like an outline. And this helps you keep it structured so you don't get confused. Let me tell you, you're going to have a lot of emotion going through this process. The more structured you are, the easier it is for you to get through, okay? Number 1 on your list is God. God is always the first person you want to get rid of your bitterness toward. And you say, well, Dwayne, I'm not bitter toward God. Okay. Keep lying to yourself and stay in bondage. That's all I have to say to that. How many of you went through and really looked at those definitions of bitterness that I gave you 2 weeks ago and studied them? If you studied those, I guarantee you can find one of those definitions that applies to your relationship with God. Somebody in this room, and remember, guys, those of you who weren't here, I'm going to make this qualification. Bitterness does not necessarily mean that you're angry. Bitterness does not necessarily show up as revenge or hatred. As a matter of fact, it's my experience that bitterness very rarely shows up that way. It's very easy to point the finger at the loud, angry, revengeful, hateful person and go, wow, they're really bitter. And it's very easy when I say things like, you're bitter towards God, for you to respond instantly with, but I'm not mad at God. I don't hate God. I didn't say you hate God. I didn't say you were mad at God. What I said is you're bitter toward God. And if you're a human being, it applies to you. Period. I don't even have to know you to make that. Well, that sure is judgmental on your part, Dwayne. Yeah, it is, because you're a human. And my judgment is that all humans develop bitterness. And guess who's the first person on the list? 90% of the time. And the rest of the time, the reason God gets on the list is because of all the relationships we have in our lives. And we begin to ask questions like, God, why would you send that person into my life? Number 1 question people ask, God, why? Anybody in this room never asked that question? Anybody? Then you're bitter. That's why you ask the question. Because you're frustrated with that. God, why? Why would you let that happen? God, why did you let me do this? God, why didn't you stop whatever? I know a person. I write about her in my book. She went through the counseling process. She came in. She had been sexually abused as a child by her stepfather. And it became a regular occurrence over the course of about 6 or 7 years. And every single time it happened, she would pray, God, please make this stop. Please make this stop. I'm begging you, make it stop. She told her mother. Her mother flatly denied it. That's not true. That can't happen. That's not happening. God, please make it stop. Make it stop. Make it stop. Make it stop for years and years and years. Eventually, what did she stop asking God for? Take a wild guess what her response toward God was. She didn't ask for anything. She concluded, there is no God. Why would a God allow this to happen? If there is a God, He would have stopped it. What about the big questions that people always ask? If there's really a God, why do so many people suffer? Why do little children die? Why are there famines? Why this? Why that? Why that? Guys, it always ends up going back to God. God and Satan are the two biggest blamed individuals ever to exist. So if you have ever asked why God, you're bitter. But you know what? I don't even have to explain that, because I know that deep down inside you, if you're honest with yourself, you'll identify. Let's go back and look at those definitions of bitterness. And I'm going to encourage you to do this, and I'm going to be pushing this all the way through today. Okay? Inward resentment. This includes any form of hostility, hatred, or revenge. Most people do not, or bitterness does not show up in most people's life this way. It does in some. It did in mine. I identified with it. But see, my thing was, hey, I know when I'm bitter because I'm mad at you and I hate you. And I want you to suffer. That's how I know I'm bitter toward you. So when the next one came along, wounded spirit, I went, yeah, I don't identify with that. Because I'm an angry guy. That's what I do. I get mad. I bow up my chest and I want to fight you. I want to make you suffer. That's how I deal with, that's bitterness in my life. Most people don't respond that way, though. My estimation now, in my experience in working with this information, is that this second definition, the wounded spirit, is the most popular way that bitterness presents itself. Let's read that together. This is a deep wound that creates an emotional pain over something that someone has said or done. It's an attack against your character. It's a disappointed expectation. In other words, that feeling of being lied to. A wounded spirit does not usually carry with it any anger or hostility towards someone else. So when you say to me, Dwayne, I don't see that I'm bitter toward my husband. I'm not mad at him. I believe you. I believe you. But if I were to talk to you about the wounded spirit that you have in your marriage, would that change our conversation? Yeah. You ever felt like your wife lied to you? You ever felt like your husband lied to you? You ever feel like somebody didn't follow through with what they said they were going to do in your life? They made a commitment to you and they disappointed that commitment? Turned around and justified it, lied about it? Have you been hurt in those situations? Sure you have. That's bitterness. That's when bitterness comes in and says, hey, boy, you sure got the raw end of that deal. I'd be hurt too if I were you. You deserve to be hurt. It's okay, and you deserve to feel like this because they're dirty, rotten scoundrels. And your emotions just feed on that, and they go, oh, yeah, that's right, I do deserve to feel hurt. I do. And you know what? Here's what's more. I deserve to pull away in this relationship. That's what I deserve to do. I've earned that. Bitterness feeds us these lies. You deserve to hate that person. You deserve to be angry toward them. Look what they haven't done. They said they were going to do stuff, and they didn't do it. I'd resent them too if I were you. Yeah, that's right. I should resent them. I've earned it. I deserve to resent them. Guys, whether you resent or whether you have a wounded spirit, bitterness is bitterness. Bitterness controls you. How does it control you? It controls you emotionally. And these are the emotions that it gets control of and starts becoming your prison. Fear, guilt, anxiety, avoidance, a sense of loss, a sense of betrayal, and abandonment. If you have these emotions in connection with relationships and even non-relationships, you know it's also possible for a human to be bitter towards inanimate objects, a situation, dreams, hopes. All those things are possible. Why? Because remember, the emotions are not logical. The emotions are illogical, irrational. They're unreasonable, and they're passionate. And that's exactly why bitterness targets the emotions. Can you imagine bitterness targeting the mind? Oh yeah, you deserve let's see, we can't say be angry because that's an emotion. We can't say be afraid because that's an emotion. Let's see, we can't say, what would we say to the mind? You should separate yourself from that person and never have contact with them again because of what they've done. And the mind would say, yeah, but Scripture tells me that I should forgive and love my neighbor, forgive my enemy, right? So that doesn't make sense, bitterness. Why would I follow that advice? See, bitterness isn't going to get real far if it attacks the mind. But when it attacks the emotions feed right into it. That's why the bitterness is unreasonable, it's illogical, and it's irrational. So guys, if you want to argue with yourselves about bitterness, let me tell you something. It's bitterness that's arguing that case for you. I know right now as I'm standing here talking, it's already starting. You've already had people popping into your mind, and bitterness has come right in and went, no, that's not true. I'm not really here. Don't listen to Dwayne. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That doesn't make any sense. That's not practical. How can bitterness even exist? Hey guys, you know what Satan's best And I mean the very best lie that he's ever been able to pull off. Any guesses? Huh? Close. Not really. Kind of. No. But you're closer. Satan's greatest lie is that he doesn't exist. He's not really there. Was the serpent really Satan? The Bible doesn't call him Satan. The Bible actually refers to the adversary, but is that Satan? There's a lot of question about that. There's a lot of people out there that don't believe there's a Satan. That doesn't exist. Even the Satanists don't believe in Satan. Did you know that? The Church of Satan doesn't even believe in Satan. That's weird, isn't it? They don't believe in Satan because the Anton, well, he probably does now. Anton LaVey does now, but if you read I have a copy of the Satanic Bible, and I've read it. And because how are you going to understand these things and apologize your faith when you're ignorant about what everybody else believes? But when you read through that, in the very beginning, they line out what they believe, and it's not Satan. They believe that Satan is a euphemism, a representation of, and then they give you a list of things. It all have to do with selfishness and self-indulgence and so on and so forth. Guys, that's Satan's whole deception, and bitterness is part of all of that. Bitterness is going to convince you it's not there. There's nothing to get rid of. Okay? All of that is going on in your soul. So when I say things like, first person on your list is God. You're bitter toward God. Immediately we well up, no, can't be. Not everybody. Some people right away, I'm bitter toward God, no question. Good for you. The rest of you, write God on your list. That's number one, God. Okay, now I want you to write this statement down underneath it. Letter A, seek forgiveness for my bitterness. I know, but we're writing your list on the back of the page because you have a personal list, okay? No, you don't have to, but you might want to mark it down, and it's going to make it a little bit easier. You guys, this is it. Part of your homework is to go home, get a fresh piece of paper, and start writing your list. You need to rewrite the list because if I write it for you, then it's not as personal. You need to make it personal. Okay? So the cat's out of the bag. The way you get rid of the bitterness is you're going to seek forgiveness for the bitterness. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that in a very particular way today. It's very important you do it in a particular way in order for it to be effective. And I'll explain why as we continue on and especially as we get into next week. Okay, number 2 on your list. After you've written ask forgiveness for your bitterness, then number 2 on your list is your spouse. Now, guys, it has to go in this order, okay? And A, again, bitterness, and then we have a B, which I'll cover in a second. This is very important because when I show you how to get rid of this bitterness, how you're going to seek forgiveness, God is part of that process with you. I am totally convinced that you are not capable of getting rid of your bitterness on your own. You must come together in relationship with God. You need God's help to make it happen. If you're bitter toward God, you're not going to make it happen. You're going to avoid Him and try to do it on your own, like you've done pretty much everything else in your life. So this is why God is first, because you can't get rid of your bitterness without God's help, and if you're bitter, you're going to avoid Him. Next is your spouse, if you're married. I'm convinced beyond any shadow of a doubt that you cannot get rid of the rest of the bitterness in your life until you're free from your spouse first. Guys, if you skip your spouse and move on to everybody else, I promise you, you're going to have to come back at a later time and redo everybody all over again. So don't skip your spouse. Question? No, not yet. I'll get to that. Okay? Number 3 is children. Now, this is where it gets personal and why I want you to rewrite the list. Because I don't know your children's names or how many you have. So you need to write down each one individually. In this case, if you have 3 kids, then it's going to be number 3, and that's Johnny. And number 4 is going to be Sally. And number 5 is going to be Tommy. And, however many kids you have, okay? So your numbers are going to start changing now from my list over there. That's why you're going to rewrite your list. Does that make sense? Okay? But for right now, we're just going to call this children. Okay? And you have an A and a B. Just like under spouse, you have a B. And you have an A for your children and a B. Okay? After children. Next is mom and dad. Together. Not on a separate line. Unless your mom and dad are divorced, then give them their own number. Okay? If they're deceased, don't worry, I got all the bases covered, guys. If they're deceased, they get their own number. Okay? So, if mom is deceased, mom gets a number. If dad's alive, dad gets a second number. If they're both deceased, you can keep them on one line. If they're both still married, you can keep them on one line. If they're both divorced, one gets a number, the other one gets another number. Does that make sense? So if they're alive together, keep them together. If they're dead together, keep them together. If they're alive and separated, separate them. If one is alive and one is dead, separate them. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, and you have an A and a B on both of them as well. All right, and number 5. We have other family members. Now we start to expand our list. This is where it gets lengthy. Siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, and so on and so forth. Step-parents, same thing. Yep. As a matter of fact, thank you for bringing up step-parents. If you go back here, if your mom is married to your stepdad, let's say, they go on the same line, then your biological dad goes on a separate line. And I'm going to be explaining this here in a little bit as to why I set it up that way, okay? Yes. Thank you. Well, I have that in the... Don't I have that in here? I do not have that in there. Okay, thank you, Linda. Linda's pointed out a good point. If you have, let's say your aunt and uncle are married, then they would be on the same line. So, my Uncle Steve and my Aunt Joe now, right? Okay. So, Uncle Steve and Aunt Joe are married right now. If I had bitterness toward both of them, they would go on the same line together. Siblings, same thing. Like my brother's married to his wife, so it would look like this. Kevin and Lori, okay, on the same line. And I'll explain why in a little bit. Okay, if you're bitter towards cousins and their spouses, they go on the same line. So married people go on the same line if there's bitterness towards both. Okay? And then number 6, anyone that I've been sexually active with outside of my marriage. And it isn't necessarily limited to while you were married. It could be before you were married. It could be the people before you were married in the first marriage and the people you were sexually active with after that first divorce and before the second marriage, and then after the second marriage and before the third marriage and so on. So anyone you've been sexually active with outside of your current marriage. No, this is... No, that's right. But what I'm saying is that if you were married, if you have an ex, that means you were married. So the sexual activity with that person in that marriage does not go on this list. This is for people outside of a marriage relationship. Okay? Okay. Yep, perfect. Okay, now 7 is where we're going to get into exes. Okay? Exes. Okay. That's right. I know. I only go to 6. Now, here's why I only go to 6, because I'm grouping up into stuff. Guys, once you hit 5, your list is going to explode right there. By the time you start looking and examining all of your family, Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, their spouses, their kids, nephews, nieces. I mean, the list can grow and grow and grow and grow. And I told you, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I have personally sought forgiveness for my bitterness from at least 100 people plus over that period of time. Now, I don't say that to scare you, because your list may not be that big. But I'm just telling you that I know I only have 6. You're going to have 30 or 40. And the older you are, the bigger the list tends to be. Okay? Just saying. All right, question, Judy. No, you did not hear me say that. I want you to, but it's a good, I'm glad you bring it up, because let me make a qualification. I want you to make the list in this order, whether they're deceased or not. In other words, if you have deceased parents, they're still number 4, even though they're deceased. If you have deceased aunts and uncles and siblings and cousins, they're still number 5, or 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever. Okay? So death is not relevant here in the order of this list. We don't skip over the dead because they're dead. Because I'm going to tell you something, your root of bitterness goes right into that grave with them, and you're still attached. Death does not separate or sever roots of bitterness. Okay? You're going to have to do that this way. The Bible teaches us how to do it. It's the only way to do it, and death doesn't do it. Okay? All right. Now, let's look down at the bottom of the page here. Bitterness is not limited to people. I mentioned this before. We're not limiting this to people. I know our list starts off with people, but it's not limited to people. Other areas of bitterness may include inanimate objects such as homes, cars, clothes, money, etc. Ideals, fantasies, circumstances, addictions, jobs, which would include employers, employees, co-workers, business deals, customers. That house that you struggled to keep a hold of in that divorce has a root of bitterness attached to it. Why is that, Dwayne? Well, let's go back to our definitions of bitterness and examine that for a moment. Oh, I would say fear might be a good example. This does not include a temporary response that would protect you from a dangerous situation. This would be a fear that is ongoing with a certain person, place, thing, or situation.
Why not loss?
Huh?
Why not loss?
Loss, and it could also be loss. Yeah, you could have multiple definitions of bitterness applying to one area of life. You better believe it. So let's read that one. This occurs when something valuable has been taken from you without your permission. Death, divorce, bankruptcy, theft, dignity, and pride are all a few examples. Okay, so when you get divorced, divorce is divorce is worse than death. I mean, at least with death, there's something definitive. We just went to the Zulik funeral Friday, and, at least there's a definition there. We know he was in a car accident, he was killed, it's done. We can grieve now and move on, hopefully. Right? But at least you can pin it on something. Right? Mel, you can say, hey, it was Mom's time. She was old and she was ready to go, right? You can. There's like this clear distinction. But divorce doesn't have that. It lingers and drags out all over the place. Years and years and years people fight over money and homes and cars and custody of kids. And it's miserable. Divorce, avoid it. I say, just avoid it. And people who get divorced, but the people who stay married for the sake of the kids, I go, well, if you're going to stay married for the sake of the kids, at least get the marriage right. Right? Because why stay miserable and unhappy in a relationship? That's not going to help the kids. And so sometimes maybe it's better to get divorced for the sake of the kids. But you can't really say that because there's no really good reason to get divorced because it's always miserable and the kids always get caught up in it no matter what. You stay together, you get divorced. Look, divorce is just ugly. It's just ugly. So there's never a good answer to that, ever. There's never a right answer. There's never a good answer. There's never a reasonable answer. It's miserable. Okay, but we were talking about inanimate objects. People get attached to their vehicles. I mean, emotionally attached to vehicles. It's crazy. Right? Huh? They're more dependable sometimes. If you live... Buy an extended warranty. But listen to me, guys. If you live in fear of losing money, you're bitter toward money. Money controls you. What else can be said? Bitterness is controlling your life from all kinds of aspects. Coke.
Wouldn't one of the primary number two for spouse, the untimely demise of a spouse, create bitterness?
Sure.
It left me
Yes.
vulnerable for a bunch of stuff.
So back to what you pointed out, the sense of loss. Something valuable is taken away from you. That marriage was important to you, and suddenly this untimely death leaves this huge void. It's a terrible sense of loss. And you know what? I'm glad you brought that up, Coke, because there's something else I want to point out a little more specifically. I've already said it, but I'm going to be very specific about it now. What I've said before is that bitterness doesn't make sense. Okay, so don't try to make sense out of it. If you sit back and go, well, let me see, I need to really noodle through. Am I really, really bitter? And how did that bitterness happen? And, and people start weighing the pros and cons. Well, I know that they did all these terrible things, but they had a lot of really good things about them too. All you're doing in that case is you're attempting to justify why you're not bitter. That's bitterness talking. Bitterness doesn't want you to be exposed. It doesn't want you to know it's there because its subtleties and its deception is how it controls you. Okay? So one thing that's important for you to know is that bitterness doesn't make any sense. It's emotional. So don't try to make sense out of it because it's not going to happen. And this is a perfect example. I have a spouse. I'm not saying this is true for Coke, but he's bringing up a good point. There's a spouse. I love this spouse. Great marriage, great relationship. Untimely demise. Now, I feel this sense of loss. Something valuable was taken from me without my permission, and I'm not dealing with that well at all. This is when bitterness takes its opportunity. So bitterness swoops in, gets control. Okay, now you are bitter toward this spouse. What did the spouse do to deserve you being bitter toward them? Nothing. So, and there we go, now we get back to I'm bitter towards God because God took that spouse. Okay, now, follow this. This is very important. I'm going to reiterate this and reiterate this and reiterate this until you want to vomit because you're sick of hearing me say it. People don't have to do anything for you to be bitter toward them. This is not about them. This is not about what they've done or they haven't done. So if you argue, they didn't do anything, I'm not bitter, I'm going to continue to take you back to, then why do you have a wounded spirit in that relationship? Then why does fear and guilt and anxiety control you with that person? It's not about what they've done. Fine, they didn't do anything. I don't know if they did anything or not, and I'm not going to sit here and argue about it, and I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you that they did these terrible rejection things to you. What I'm going to focus in on is where are you at emotionally right now in that relationship with that person? It's not about what they've done. It's that you've had the wrong attitude. It's your response to them that's the problem, not what they've done, even if they did reject you. Guys, I'm a hardcore guy. If you don't know that by now, because I come out here and I go, there's no such thing as fair, and we don't try. This is crap theology. It's crap psychology. It's junk. It doesn't mean anything. It's just there to help us feel better about our prisons that we keep ourselves in. Well, I tried. Oh, good for you, buddy. You tried. That's all that matters. You gave it a good try. All that does is just helps you feel better about your bondage. It doesn't solve any problems. It's not true. You are staying trapped in the prison and the deception. of your bondage. So I'm going to also be hardcore when it comes to this, and I'm going to tell you, I don't care what they did to you. I could care less how bad they rejected you. It makes no difference. Okay, so what? He went out and he had an affair with 15 women, and he had 4 different families with 100 kids. So what? What's that got to do with your bitterness toward him? You show me one place in those Holy Scripture that says, when I am treated badly, it is a right and justifiable response to become bitter. I dare anybody to show me that verse. That's exactly right. So, guys, I don't care what they've done to you. You're wrong for being bitter toward them. Period. You're wrong. You have no justification for being bitter toward those people in your life. Okay? You're letting the bondage control you when you're free from the bondage. It puts Christ to an open shame. Can I add a little bit of genuine guilt here? Christ died so you could be free. Why do you still walk in bondage instead of in newness of life? Because you're so busy focused on what they did to you. Yeah, that's right. Even when you justify in your mind, well, that's okay. I know why they did what they did, so I'm okay with that. But meanwhile, you're still wounded over it. You still feel like you've been abandoned. You're not really okay with it. Let's go back to the grieving stages again. I messed up on these page numbers, so I can't give you a page, but if you'll go back before man's design, title of that page is Stages of Grieving. Whew, we got to get going. I want to hit this real quick, and then I'm going to give you the script. We're going to do a script, okay? That's your homework. The stages of grieving are shock. I can't believe it. It didn't happen to me. Or I can't believe it happened to me. And right after we get through that shock, we move into denial. Denial is made up of 3 primary emotions: anger, guilt, and grief. And we tend to cycle through these 3. I'm angry. It's not fair. I don't deserve this. I feel guilty. What could I have done? What should I have done? It's hurting. Part of me is dying. That's the grief part. And we vacillate with these emotions. We get stuck right here. People tell me all the time, oh yeah, I dealt with that years ago. And I just listen to their conversation and I can hear they haven't dealt with anything. They're telling me about all their anger. They're telling me about all their pain they still have. They don't know they're telling me that, but people talk. It's amazing. All you have to do is just listen. You don't have to analyze people. I'm not talking about any of that. You just listen, and you guys, trust me, when you start getting free of your bitterness, if you follow through with what I teach you, you're going to start hearing other people's conversations very differently. You're going to start going, wow, they're really bitter. Those poor people, they don't even know how bitter they are. You love to talk, emotions love to talk about its pain and how they've been wronged and all the bad stuff in their life and poor me and I'm such a victim. But hey, I've dealt with that. I turned it over to the Lord. I'm just letting go and letting God. Really? Yeah, okay, keep telling yourself that. Coke.
Masking it with indifference.
There you go. Perfect. Masking it with indifference. Absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. People are people. That's fine. Okay, well, I'd hate to be married to you. No emotion. Totally cold. Because, guys, you can't pick and choose your indifference. You know that, right? You have to be different to everything or nothing. You can't be, I'll be indifferent to this, but I'm going to get totally wrapped up emotionally in this over here. Oh, no. You can't take those kinds of risks. If you're the person that pulls away and shuts down emotionally, there's no way you're going to take a risk over here if you're not willing to do it here. Georgianne. Aha. What's the difference? Okay, here's the difference. Thank you for pointing that out. Because the way to get out of denial is to be in acceptance. But what's in between denial and acceptance on this page? Huh? No. After the anger, guilt, and the grief, the brick wall of bitterness. That's the answer to the question, Georgianne. When you get free of your bitterness, then and only then can you genuinely move into acceptance. So, yes. So write bitterness on your brick wall in that red line. So here's what happens. People say, it happened and it happened to me. There's your indifference. They're not able to say, yeah, I'm okay with that. That's how you can tell the difference between whether or not you really are accepting or not. And I figured this out after a lot of years of counseling, because I would counsel people who would tell me after, I'm fine with that. Yeah, it happened to me. I'm okay with that. I mean, they wouldn't say I'm okay with it, but it happened to me. I can admit that. I've dealt with that. But I know sitting there working with them, that's not true. If that were true, you wouldn't be responding like this in these other relationships with men. You wouldn't be responding this way with your son or daughter. You wouldn't be doing these other. They're all connected. So, one day I asked the client, I said, okay, that's fine. You admit that it's happened to you. You can acknowledge that intellectually, but where are you at emotionally with it? Are you okay with that? Can you honestly say to me that you're okay? That you've reconciled emotionally that this has happened to you. It's one thing to intellectually acknowledge that it's happened. It's another thing to be reconciled emotionally to it. And boy, she broke right there and flooded. I mean, whoa, the sobbing was unbelievable. And I knew, that's it right there. That's why I added this. Then I wrote that in that day. I drew a line and I went in. I'm okay with that. That's the question. The reconciliation emotionally is what we're going for, not the intellectual acknowledgement. We can shut down emotionally and become indifferent, but intellectually go, yeah, that happened to me. Okay, so what? Fine, but are you really reconciled? Guys, reconciliation is it, and I'm telling you, you can't do it until the bitterness is gone. Cannot be done. Okay, so let's move into our homework, the rest of our homework. So that's your list. So you guys get to go home and make a big old list, okay? I want you to do it in that order. Break it out. Remember, you can have 3 siblings and, 4 aunts and uncles and 10 cousins and 4 grandparents, and already your list is going to be like 25 people. Okay? And we haven't even gotten into the other stuff, number 6. All right? And then if you get into this one can get pretty big too. If you're going to be honest, a lot of you. I know it was for me. Okay. So here's how we do this. Step number 1. Now, guys, again, let me reiterate. You've got to do your action therapy with God before you can do your action therapy with anybody else. Here's why. Because step 1 is this. Before you seek forgiveness from anyone for your bitterness, I want you to pray this prayer. Okay? We're just going to put Bill in the blank just for, not for any reason particular, just so we can read this together, okay? Oh, I didn't pass those out yet? Sorry. Here you go. Here you go. Okay, let's put Dwayne's name in the line. We'll do it that way, okay? That way nobody feels singled out here. Remember what I said. You cannot get free of your bitterness without God's participation with you. It's critical. Okay? You cannot, I'll say it again, you cannot get free of your bitterness without God's participation. So this prayer is a very important prayer to start everything off with. Are we short on that side? There's one more. I have another one. Anybody not have one? Okay. Here, got one right there. All right. Here we go. Ready, guys? Let's read this prayer together. 1, 2, 3. Lord, I'm trusting you to handle Dwayne's response so that I don't come away feeling guilty or rejected. Now, what's that? No, this is going to be the person you're calling. Okay. So now that I've said that, let me set the rest of this up. Here's how you're going to do this. You're going to contact each person that you're bitter toward by phone only. Let me say this again. You're going to contact each person that you're bitter toward by phone only. You are not to do this in person, with two exceptions, which I'll be getting to in a moment. Okay? I'll say this one more time. You are to contact the person that you're bitter toward by phone only. Now I'll explain why here in a little bit. First, let's get through the script, okay? Because we have different scenarios. Some people are married and some people are single. So I have two different scripts for you. Remember this. First, God has to be part of this with you, or it's not going to work. Because what will happen is you're going to get on the phone and you're going to ask this person to forgive you for their bitterness, and it's a normal response for them to say, well, what did I do to make you bitter? And instantly, you're going to start taking on all this guilt and fear and feel like you need to explain something, and especially if they didn't do anything, now what do I say? And the whole thing falls apart and you hang up the phone just as bitter as you were when you picked it up. Okay? So this is why God is so important in this. You're going to basically be saying, look, people say it all the time, I'm giving this to the Lord. Okay, guess what? This time you're really going to do that. Okay? It's not just going to be something you blindly say, because that's what all Christians say. Lord, I'm trusting you. I don't know if I need to say anything after that. You've got to trust the Lord here. This is hard, guys. I mean, I know you're freaking out about it just thinking about doing it. Wait till you actually pick up the phone. You're going to be shaking. Oh, man, this is tough. And I get that. Believe me, I've told you, I've done this over 100 times myself. I've been through this emotion, and guess what? It never gets easier. By the time you get to 31, it's not like, man, I got this down. No. It's like you're doing the first one. It never gets easy. Never. Because bitterness does not want to let go of you. Ever. Every single time that you seek to destroy a root of bitterness in your life, bitterness fights even harder to keep a hold of you. That's why it's never easy. Okay? This is tough. And so if you don't go into this with the attitude of, Lord, I'm trusting you, then you're never going to get through it. And what are you trusting the Lord for? To handle that other person's response. Lord, I'm going to let you deal with them. I'm not going to accept any more responsibility for how that person feels. I'm not going to accept any more responsibility for what they're thinking or what kind of reaction they have or any threats they make or whatever this huge thing that you've made up in your mind that you're absolutely sure they're going to say. They probably won't, but you're convinced they will. Your bitterness is going to use those fears to keep you from making phone calls. Oh, Lord, you better not call that person. You know what they're going to tell you. Don't listen. Lord, I don't care what they say. I'm trusting you to handle their response. It's not my responsibility anymore. Guys, that's why you're in bondage. You know that? Because you're so busy running around accepting responsibility for how everybody else feels. That's what our political correctness is all about. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be sensitive to people, but it's different. Deference is much different than assuming responsibility for everybody else's emotional condition. Deference. Deference is when it's a self-discipline that says, I know this is going to be offensive to that person, so I'm refraining from saying that. The Apostle Paul talks about it. He calls it a stumbling block. If you know that something is a stumbling block in somebody else's life, refrain from that. Even though you're free to do that, exercise deference and refrain from that so you won't offend them or cause them to fall in some way in temptation. Okay, that's deference. But that's not what we practice. What we practice is, oh my God, I would hate to offend you and I would hate for you to be mad at me. Now it's all about you and now they're controlling you and you're trying to control them. Hey guys, part of what allows me to stand up here and teach what I teach and say what I say without any fear and to say, don't agree with me. I don't expect you to agree with me. I don't even want you to agree with me. I could care less if you agree with me. All I care about is truth. Part of what allows me to do that with such genuineness is the fact that I'm free mentally and emotionally. I'm not worried about what you're going to think about it. Now, I'm interested in what you think about it because I want to help you live in a life that's free. That I'm interested? Oh, man. You gonna make me think back that far? Listen, I don't care what you think about what I'm doing and what I'm teaching, but I'm concerned about it. That's the difference. I'm interested in it because I want to know, because I want you to learn, and I want you to live in truth and freedom. So I'm interested in it. No, it's that I'm not worried. I'm not worried about if I'm teaching you truth and you're offended by truth, then that's your problem. And I'm not going to be worried about that. You got the right to be wrong, okay? That's fine. But if I, and I, like one time when I misspoke in here one time, and I said, the Bible says blah, blah, blah. And then I went back and researched that and figured out the Bible didn't say that. And I came back, right, and I made that correction. Why? Because what's important to me is truth. That's what's important to me, is truth. Now, but we don't live our lives that way. We live our lives in fear of what other people are going to say and do, and whether or not they're going to reject us, and how much they rejected us, and how much the rejection hurts, it doesn't hurt. The bondage that we live in with the bitterness prevents us from interacting in these relationships because we're too afraid to be honest and live in truth. Okay, so here you go for the married people, those of you who are married. And spouses are living with you, not exes. These are relationships where people are together. You prayed your prayer. You guys are going to sit down together and make these calls. You do not do these separately if you're married. Because the two have become one. Everything that's happening with your spouse, you may not have the same roots of bitterness as your spouse has. They may not have the same roots of bitterness that you have. But because the two are one, his roots are affecting her, and her roots are affecting him. I just said that. You must do this together, okay? So here's how this works. Brian, let's say that you and Alicia are ready to do this, okay? And you, because you're the husband, you're going to take the leadership in this exercise. And so what I want you to do is I want you to practice this, okay? If you wouldn't mind helping me out there. So you've already prayed your prayer. You and Alicia are sitting there together. You got the phone in your hand, and you dial the phone. Okay? The other person, I don't know, let's say it's mom. Dad, okay? We'll say it's dad. All right? So you're going to practice this, and you're going to put dad's name in that blank line and Alicia's name where it says spouse, okay? And just read that one time. Whew, that's huge, isn't it? For a lot of reasons. Now, generally I get the reaction, well, why do I have to say I have problems in my marriage? That's nobody's business. True. But you don't have to go into details of the problems in the marriage. And you may have a pretty good marriage, and you may say, well, I don't know that we really have a lot of problems in our marriage. Nothing really major, nothing catastrophic. That's not really the point. The point is this. His bitterness is your bitterness. You know what I mean? In that it affects you. Her bitterness is his bitterness in that it affects him. And because of that, it creates conflict in your relationship. This is for your benefit, not for the person that you're calling. Because here's what we do, married people. We hide in our relationships. We hide from the problems that we have. We become indifferent. We excuse them away. We justify stuff. Or we just flat out ignore it. Or we scream and yell and fight with each other about it all the time. There's lots of different responses. But what we're not doing is we're not stopping and going, hey, we got some issues that need to be dealt with. Now's the time to make that happen. And when you say that to somebody else, what you're saying is, you know what? Because of the bitterness that I have toward you, it's causing conflict in my relationship. Saying that out loud is bringing you to the place where you're able to start dealing and reconciling with those issues in the relationship. Because we love to do everything up here in our head. It's a totally different conversation when you start writing things down on paper. It's really different when you write things down versus all this stuff. You guys have arguments in your head with everybody, right? I know I'm going in this room today, I'm going to have this meeting, and I know this jerk in the corner, he's going to say, and when he says that, you know what I'm going to say back? I'm going to say this. And then I know when I say that, he's going to say that. And then that person over there is going to defend him. And they're going to jump in. And then I'm really going to let him have. Come on, everybody has those arguments in their head. Those fantasy arguments, right? Okay, it's time to stop doing that in your head. It's time to start getting real about what's going on in our life. And guess what? There's no shame in having problems in your marriage. Has anybody in this room ever been married and had no problems ever? Okay? So all we're doing what the modern society says. We just getting real, yo. We're getting real. Okay, stop. Okay, I'll stop. No, we're not. Does it say anything about why we're bitter towards Dad? Yeah. Dad's going to wonder. I'm so glad you brought that up. So I want you to skip down. Cindy, as a matter of fact, before we do that, who's a person on your list? You know that you're going to make that call. All right. Well, you're not going to call your dad. He's dead. Someone you're going to call. I got a different one for that. But go ahead and your brother-in-law. What's his name? Dean. Okay. Write his name, or not write, but just say his name in that blank and then read that one time real quick. Yes, for the single script. Yep. Okay. Now, let's skip down to the next paragraph. Once you've asked the question, you're looking for a yes or a no answer. Once they've answered the question, move to letter B on your list, if it applies. Again, you will wait for a yes or no answer. Once they have answered politely, pass the phone to your spouse if you're married, and if that person is also on your spouse's list, or end the call, in your case, Cindy, and go on to the next person on your list. If they do not give an answer and want to discuss the reason for the call, or attempt to change the subject, we go on to step 3. Step 3 is keep your conversation short and focused on your bitterness. After you have asked for their forgiveness, have a meek and quiet spirit. Dismiss any rejection they may give you. If they attempt to draw you into a conversation about why you have been bitter, the only response you are to use is, "It's nothing that you have done. It's that I have had the wrong attitude. Would you please forgive me for my bitterness?" So what? So what? No. Guys, stop for a second. No, this is important because I know everybody else is thinking the same thing. Cindy, why does that matter? Here's why that matters. And what I'm about to say to you is true for every person in this room. Because you guys have spent your whole life trying to get everybody to think that you're okay. And you're not. And it's time that you start getting real about that and dealing with it. You're not okay. You're bitter, and you're wounded, and you live in fear, and you have doubts and insecurities, and your mind and emotions are in conflict with each other, and you hate it when you get rejected, and you don't know what to do about it, and so you respond with all the wrong responses. And it's okay. Because it's true for every single human being. The difference is that you are the one now that has the courage to admit what he won't admit. Because it's true for him too. It doesn't matter why you're bitter. That's not the point. The point is you're bitter. That's the point. It doesn't matter what they think about it or what their opinion is. What matters is that you get free from the bitterness. And that's why we have this step right here. It's so critical that you say it's not anything that you've done. It's that I've had the wrong attitude. Who are we focusing in on that point? Me. Are we blaming other people? Are we taking the victim position? No. We're standing up, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We're accepting responsibility for our response instead of blaming them for their actions or lack thereof. Does that make sense? It's not what you've done. It's that I've had the wrong attitude. Okay, now, step 4. After you've asked their forgiveness the 3rd time. So you might have to repeat that. So here's how it goes. You make the call. First time, would you please forgive me for my bitterness toward you? What do you mean bitterness? What did I do to make you bitter? It's nothing that you've done. It's that I've had the wrong attitude. Would you please forgive me for my bitterness toward you? Well, I don't understand why you're making this phone call. Why would you be calling me? Okay, it's not anything you've done. It's that I've had the wrong attitude. You've repeated it twice. Would you please forgive me for my bitterness? That's the third time you've asked the question. Yeah, but this doesn't make any sense, Cindy. Okay, now we move to step 4. After you've asked their forgiveness for the third time and they still refuse your request, you are to say, read that, Cindy. Step 4. And hang up the phone. Hang up the phone and take back ownership of your life. Their response isn't relevant. Don't answer the phone. No, that's a valid question. Hold on, everyone. Hold on. With whom? Why? No. Yes. Okay, great. I'm glad you brought that up. Read. No. Here's why. Read that sentence at the very bottom of the page, Cindy. Read that. When I focus on my attitude, I focus on others' actions. Guys, I know that you've been hurt by other people in this world. I know that. You've been deeply, deeply wounded by people. But you have to understand something. If you want to operate in freedom, the true freedom that Christ gave us, then you've got to take ownership of your life so that other people's actions no longer have that effect on you. I told you when we started this isn't going to be easy. Question. Okay. Right. She focused more on her than what they did. That's good. But I want to interrupt you real quick because I want to be careful about something with that. That is forgiving other people. And I don't know her and I don't know her situation, but I know people and I know this truth. I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, I'm not bitter, Dwayne. I forgave them. Oh, really? Okay. So if that's true, which I personally doubt, because up to that point, you've got so many other roots of bitterness that when traumas like that happen, bitterness, it's so easy for bitterness to get in at that point because there's so much other bitterness there, okay? Now, I'm not going to say that she didn't do what she said she did because I think it's possible for that to happen. I just think it's really, really rare. So I'm careful with those stories because as we're going to learn, as we learned last week, you cannot forgive other people if there's bitterness there. Bitterness prevents forgiveness. If you have bitterness toward those people, you haven't forgiven them. Okay? But I thank you for pointing out that. She was focused. If she did what she says she did and she truly forgave them, it was only because she was able to focus on her response and not what they did. Yes. That's right. I agree. And I've had people that are in shock that say that, and then later, when they're out of the shock, the grieving denial stage begins, and now all this emotion comes. And what they thought they had forgiven, they now are finding themselves having not forgiven all this time later. I've seen that happen too. So I'm just putting a caution out there. I'm not saying it's not possible for people to forgive in those scenarios. But I'm always skeptical of it because I know the power that bitterness has in people's lives. But the point is still the same that you're bringing out and that I'm pointing out. It doesn't matter what they did. Yeah, they were wrong. Yes, they hurt you. Yes, all of those terrible things happened. What are you going to do about it? What is telling him all that stuff going to do? It's just going to flare up and fan that old flame. It's just going to get him defensive. It's just going to start a big fight, and then you end up at the place you started. So turn the page. Let's address a few other situations. And I'm moving as quickly as I can, but you guys have to have all of this if you're going to do this well, okay? What if they're dead? Or what if I can't find them? Or what if they won't answer my call? In those cases, I want you to write letters to those people on your list who are deceased or you're unable to contact by phone. Make a commitment to yourself and with the Lord that the next time you come in contact with that person, you will seek their forgiveness. Okay? So, I don't know, you've got somebody on your list, you can't find them, you haven't seen them in 10 years, you don't have any way to get a hold of them. Write a letter in that case. Okay? Spill your guts. Just like you were just talking about now, do that in a letter. And I recommend, and I mentioned it down here, but I recommend that, particularly in this case, but some of you will have the same situation, write a letter to Dean before you call him. Take all that stuff that you were just talking about and write it all out. The letter serves no purpose other than just giving you the opportunity to vent. That's all the value it has. Good value. But and a lot of people do that, they call it journaling or whatever. It doesn't really work very well because it's temporary. You ventilate, but if you don't get rid of the bitterness, guess what? It all builds back up again. This time it's going to be different. Ventilate on paper, then get rid of the bitterness. Then I'm going to start teaching you how to break these habits so it doesn't build back up again. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's how you write a letter. In the letter only in the letter, you don't do this on the phone, you only do this in a letter, you talk about why you've been bitter. Okay, here's an example of how that letter might look. Dear person, place, or thing that I'm bitter toward. I'm writing this letter because I realize how you blankety blank blank me and others, and now I can say I'm not going to take it, and you're not the boss of me, and furthermore, whatever. So take that, you filthy animal, and I don't even know why I'm writing this letter because I don't feel bitter. You did the best you could with what you had. I cared so much about our relationship. Why do you think that you are whatever? I love you so much, and I hope you rot in hell. Thank you for all you've done for me. I hate you. Okay, what is that all about? Those are illogical, unreasonable, irrational emotions. It makes no sense. Guys, if you go back and read your letter after you write it, you're going to go, did I really write that? No, you didn't write that. You know who wrote that? That 8-year-old little child in you wrote that. That wounded 8-year-old little kid wrote that letter. And it makes no sense. But you need to write that letter because you need an opportunity to ventilate and purge and clean all this junk out of you that you've been holding on to for all this time. Okay? When you're done with this letter, then you write your script. The reason I'm writing this letter, Dean, is because I've been having some emotional problems. If it's a marriage, use the marriage script here. The Lord has revealed to me that part of the problem is I need to ask you to forgive me for something. Would you forgive me for my bitterness toward you? Okay? This is critical, guys, to do this. And then after you write that letter, Cindy, I want you to take that letter and I want you to destroy it. I don't care how you destroy it. Matter of fact, you're probably going to have a lot of letters. You might want to collect them all, keep them, until you're done writing all your letters. And then I want you to have a big ceremony. No, listen to me, guys. This is important. I know it's going to sound silly, but it's important. You need to have a ceremony. You need to make a little bonfire in the backyard or whatever and burn those suckers. And maybe pray a little prayer, Lord, thank you for the freedom. You need to celebrate your freedom. Guys, our emotions need ceremony. Did you know that? We need ceremony. The mind doesn't need ceremony. Okay, so you made the call, you're done. Get on with life. But your emotions can't do it that easy. They need ceremony. Flush them down the toilet. Have a ceremony around your toilet and flush them one at a time. You know, something memorable. Something that you can point back to and say, on this date, at this time, I dealt with these issues. Make it a ceremony. I don't care what the ceremony is. You decide. But make it a good one. Okay? Now, hold your questions because I'm answering more as we go along. Okay, so that's the next paragraph. Here's the key thing. Avoid giving your letters to anybody. Do not write your mom a letter and then mail it to her. If you're married, for those of you who are married, you write your letters, give them to your spouse. Let Alicia read your letters. Alicia, let Brian read your letters. Why is that so important, you think? Huh? Because you're one. I guarantee you there's stuff that this guy's got going on inside of him that you maybe suspect about but don't know for sure or didn't have a clue. And vice versa. And when you give your letters to one another and you let each other read, you're bonding in a way that you've never been able to bond before. Every time that a root of bitterness is eliminated from your life, a bond of love is attached to her in a whole new way that you haven't experienced before. This is going to revolutionize you guys' marriage. I guarantee it. Every root of bitterness you get rid of, Alicia, a bond of love attaches to him in his place. So when you're reading each other's letters, you guys are bonding together. Deep emotional bonding that wasn't possible before this because of the bitterness in your life. And then after you read your letters, go do your ceremony together and destroy your letters. This is phenomenal stuff. What was it, honey? Yeah, oh, thank you. That's one good example or qualification. Don't give your letter to one another. If you write her a letter, she doesn't need to read that junk. And vice versa. Okay, that's the only one. But all the other letters, yes, give to one another. Okay, 3 T's of action therapy, and then I'm done. Here's some suggestions and advice to follow during action therapy. Number 1, the first T is time. Keep your calls short, approximately 60 seconds or less. Any longer means you've allowed them to control the call. You're still in bondage. Because, guys, if you're on that phone call longer than a minute, you have gotten into a conversation about everything else in the world. I don't care what the weather's like. I don't care what they've been up to lately. I don't care how the kids are. That's not the purpose of this call. The purpose of this call is to get free from your bitterness and hang up. If they start sucking you in, it's because you feel guilty about what you're doing. And you're still in bondage. Make as many calls as possible, but be sure to pace yourself so that you don't get overwhelmed. This one call might be all you can handle in a day. That's fine. Make that one call. Rest the rest of the day. Tomorrow, make another one. Okay? Pace yourself. Don't do 100 calls in a day. You'll kill yourself. It's ridiculous. Okay? 3 to 5 calls a day is a good pace. If you avoid these calls for weeks and months, you're choosing to stay in bondage. Don't avoid them. Adjust your schedule to complete these calls in a timely manner. That's time. Next T is terms. The purpose of your action therapy calls is to take back ownership of your life so you can experience a world of mental and emotional freedom through the grace of God in the way He intended. Allowing the person you are calling to determine the content of the call identifies the fear and guilt that you have with this person, which gives them control over your life. Keep the focus on seeking forgiveness for your bitterness. Any other conversation, as I said, the weather, this class that you're in, why you're bitter, anything, it renders the action therapy ineffective, and calling a second time will be necessary. If you are married, seek forgiveness from your mate before making any other calls. Be sure to have your spouse with you when you make your calls. Talking to anyone else without your mate beside you renders action therapy ineffective, and calling a second time will be necessary. If a person on your list is not answering the phone, then continue through your list and come back to that person later. Okay? The third T is turf. Be sure you contact everyone on your list by phone only, with certain exceptions, and I'm going to list those in a minute. Doing your action therapy by phone allows you the needed privacy and time to process emotionally. If you do this exercise in the other person's environment, it's a typo there, it will be impossible to maintain control of the conversation. And when you are in the other person's environment, they control the situation. When you're in a public place, circumstances control the situation, and you'll not have the freedom to end the conversation and move on to the next person. So guys, don't tell someone, let's go get a cup of coffee and try to do it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You can't get away from them. You're stuck. You're trapped. Now you've got to explain things. Do it on the phone so that you have the control. You can hang it up. You can end the call. Okay? Now here's the exceptions. The spouse is your exception to doing it by phone. Doing action therapy with your spouse, current spouse, in person is very important, and your spouse, you and your spouse have become one, and this process will create a healthy bond, as I was talking about. All right? So, Brian, for example, you're going to do your action therapy with God. You write God a letter. That's the best way to do God. Write God a letter. Okay? When you're done with that letter, give it to your wife, and then do action therapy with your wife. Now, let's go back to couple of pages over where we started with the first steps. No, I'm sorry. We started with the action therapy, the very first page that I gave you today. And let's look at letter B. You see under spouse, we have seek forgiveness for my bitterness. Now you know how to do that, right? Now what's letter B? Letter B is this. Seek forgiveness for failing as a husband or a wife. How many of you in here can say, I never failed in my marriage? Exactly. Well, if you're married, you have to be married. That's the qualifier. But guys, listen, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to sit down and try to make lists and lists of all the things. Try to go back and remember 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 50 years ago in some cases. What are all the things that I failed at and did and was wrong? It's impractical and it's impossible. So we're just going to capture it all in one statement, okay? I failed as a husband. I failed as a wife. We're not going to bother nitpicking all the details of that. We're just coming to the reconciliation that I failed. Would you please forgive me for failing as a husband? Getting rid of your bitterness toward her and seeking forgiveness for your failure as a husband creates a new playing field. We clean slate now. We get to start over. Same thing. For failing as a husband, for failing as a wife, and seeking forgiveness for your bitterness gives you a clean slate. Guys, you can't go on and build a healthy relationship when you're carrying all the junk and the guilt for all the failures that you've had. You've got to get rid of that. And the spouse needs to say, I forgive you. You need to hear that yes response. Everything gets to start over now. Okay? When it comes to your children, that's the next one. If we go back to that page, you might want to keep your finger in place. Go back to that last page. Children, if person on your list is a child living in your home, or is not your child, but is under the age of 18, sit in front of them in a lower position. Sit on the floor, put them up on a chair or the sofa in front of you. And look up at that child. Put your hand on their foot or their leg, touch them, and go through the script. Little Johnny, the reason that I'm talking to you right now, and don't change the script because they're little kids. Well, they're not going to understand if it didn't. No, of course they're not going to understand. Nobody you do this with is going to understand. Let's just get that clear right now. Okay? Nobody's going to understand this. You don't even understand it. And I've spent almost an hour and 15 minutes explaining it to you, and you still don't understand it. There's no way you're going to be able to get them to understand it. That doesn't matter. Look at that child, touch their foot, their leg, and look up at them. Let them look down at you. This is important psychologically. We don't want the child to think they're in trouble. We don't want them to be feeling afraid or nervous. And if you sit lower than them and look up at them, it relaxes them. Okay? And then go through your script, word for word. Get your book out, set it on the floor, look at it, and read it if you have to. But word for word. The reason I'm talking to you is because I've been having some emotional problems, or we've been having problems in our marriage. And the Lord has revealed to me that part of the problem is I need to ask you to forgive me for something. Would you please forgive me for my bitterness toward you? And that little child is going to look at you and say, yeah, of course, sure, yes. Because that's the way little children are. They do. Some may not. Yeah. Okay, wait. Let's not jump. Let's stay with the kids. If the child is your child, you have a Part B. Part B is this. It's on the front page there in the initial list. Part B is this. Would you please forgive me for failing as a father? Would you please forgive me for failing as a mother? Guys, clean the slate in your life. It's the only way to do it. If you have grown children, you call them on the phone. But Part B still applies. Son, the reason I'm calling you is because your mother and I have been having some problems in your marriage. Boy, it's about time you guys admit that. Okay. Grown out of the house, over the age of 18. Okay? And the reason I'm calling is because your mother and I have been having some problems in our marriage. The Lord has revealed to me that part of the problem is I need to ask you to forgive me for something. Would you please forgive me for failing? Would you please forgive me for my bitterness toward you? Okay, sure. Thank you. And one other thing, son, would you please forgive me for failing as a father? Guarantee you there's going to be dead silence on the other end of that phone. You wait. The two go hand in hand. You wait and you wait and you wait until you hear a yes or a no. I don't care which one. You just want one. It doesn't matter if they say no. Because remember, their response isn't the issue here. What you're doing is what makes it work. The fact that you're asking is what makes it work. They don't have to say yes. Okay? And then, when you finally get their response, you say, thank you. Here's your mother. And mom gets to do the same thing. Okay? Letter A, letter B. Does that make sense? Okay, question. Yep. What's step 2? Go back to step 2. Go back a page or two and look at step 2. Turn your page over. Okay. Okay, good. So here's what happens. Here's what happens. Let's see, I said step 2. I'm sorry, step 3. So Tracy, go to step 3. You've asked the question, please forgive me for my bitterness toward you. Okay? You're waiting for their response. Most of the time, 95, 98% of the time, people are caught so off guard on this that they just go, okay, yeah, sure, I forgive you. Because they don't know what else to say. Okay? Great, thank you. One other thing I need to ask you, will you please forgive me for failing as a mother? Now, if at any point in either one of those questions they start asking, well, what do you mean? Well, what did I do? Well, how? That's when you invoke step 3. It's nothing you've done. See, you're answering their concern. It's nothing you've done. What did I do? Nothing. Okay, good. That's a good question. When they say that, say, it doesn't really do me any good to go through the whole list. It would take us forever. I failed as a mother. Would you please forgive me? Now, yep, just blanket like that. You do not get into a conversation. Tracy, here's why. The minute that you divulge what was the word I was just getting ready to say? You delve in, that's the word I'm looking for. The minute that you delve into appeasing them for any reason at all, you have just shackled yourself back again. Why? Have you not failed as a mother? Okay. Okay, well, that doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. Go back to the. No. It's a good point, but I want you to make sure you're clear. Go back to that first page. Very first page I gave you. It says action therapy at the top. My bitterness list. Okay, go down to number 3 where it says children. No. Bitterness list. Okay. There you go, right there. Go down to number 3. That's fine. Go down to number 3 where it says children. Letter B. What does it say? Okay, stop. For what? Failing. Does it say for being an overall failure? For having totally failed? You're failing. Have you failed as a mother? Okay. So you have, it's right, you are. And don't do that with yourself. See, this is bitterness. This is a classic situation of bitterness going, don't do this, don't do this. Okay? You have failed as a mother. Because you're a mother. That goes with the territory. That doesn't mean you're a total and complete utter failure, that you have completely failed and there's no return. I don't know what all you make that mean. But if you have had failures, then you have been failing along the way. Right? Okay. So all we're doing is we're coming to that reconciliation. I have failed as a mother. Would you please forgive me for that? That's it. We don't need the list because the list isn't relevant. Besides all that, it's impossible to make that list. Question? That you fail.
No, but what if you don't have bitterness for that person in your life?
Well, how do you know? Okay, good question. No, go back. Go back to that list of bitterness. The first thing I handed out to you today, that additional, it says evidence of bitterness. No, other way. You were right. No. Oh, okay. She's got the evidence. Oh, I handed you one. I thought I handed you one. Okay. Well, it looks like this. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'm going to give you those lists before you leave today. That's how you identify the bitterness in your life. Okay? Do that when you're making your list. This is true, 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 this is definitely true. If there's an X in there, that's going to be true. These are all givens. It's when you start moving outside of those groups that you start questioning, is there really bitterness here or not? Okay? Friends that you've had, people you've worked with, those kinds of relationships. Those come into question. These don't come into question. If you have a heartbeat, you're bitter towards God, your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, your extended family members, anyone you've been sexually active with outside of a marriage, and your ex-spouses. Those are all absolute, no questions, you're bitter. Period. Shouldn't even be thinking about it. Maybe you can question aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins, maybe. Okay? Depending on... But again, bitterness doesn't make sense, so don't try to make sense out of it. A lot of times, absent grandparents, they never even did anything because you never saw them. But that's the whole point. You felt abandoned. That's one of the definitions of bitterness. Okay? All right, last thing here, and then we're going to go. And we're going to continue this next week, okay? So, we're not finished. What should I expect emotionally? Oh, this is the big question everybody wants to know up front. Everyone is different, so you may experience different emotions while doing your action therapy. You may experience extreme emotions in some cases, ranging from anxiety and anger and depression, all the way back to delight or joy and peace. Success or failure of this technique should not be based on your emotional response. Go with what you know. Your emotions will change. Ground yourself in truth. If your action therapy is carried out sincerely and completely, you will experience a freedom from that person, place, or thing that you've been bitter toward. You will begin to develop the fruit of the Spirit in your life in a way that you have not previously been able to. If you're married, a new emotional attachment toward your mate will be experienced. Okay? So, I'm going to officially dismiss, but I'm also going to hang out here for a little while longer.